As the last speaker, I feel it necessary to warn you that I am certainly not going to draw together all of the themes and ideas that were presented today. In fact, what I'm going to do is just ask one question and propose one of many possible answers to that question. The question is, what can civil society do for victims of terrorism and for victims of counterterrorism, bad counterterrorism? And the one of many several possible answers that I want to talk about is international humanitarian law, the law of armed conflict. I feel it is an extremely undertapped resource that's available to civil society. But first, I want to make an observation. And the observation is that in the United States, you are more likely to be killed in an accident with your own furniture than by terrorism. Why would I make this observation, especially on the heels of our last presentation? I think it is useful to recognize that much of counterterrorism practice and policy doesn't come from the head, it comes from the heart. And the heart is not always the wisest counselor. I happen to have been in New York, although I was working in Geneva at the time, but I was in New York a couple of weeks after September 11, 2001, attending a UN session involving the development of the International Criminal Court. And at that time, the then mayor of New York, Rudy Giuliani, was asked to address the General Assembly. It was the first convening of the General Assembly after the 9/11 attacks. And he made a stirring speech in which I was left with two impressions. One is that it is the position of the United States that you are either with us or against us. If you're not with us, in all respects, you are against us. Number two, we don't care about root causes of terrorism. We care about getting the terrorists. These themes were overwhelmingly accepted by the reaction of the vast majority of those sitting in that General Assembly chamber that day. Okay, it was just a couple of weeks after 9/11. Later, with the implementation of the UN Counterterrorism Strategy, the head began to play a more significant role, and the concepts of international law and human rights in particular began to weave their way into the ideas of a global counterterrorism strategy. But it still continues, I think, to be largely fear, that is, the influence of the heart, that guides so much of what is counterterrorism practice and policy today, and the national security agendas of countries of the world. By contrast, the idea that bad counterterrorism breeds even more terrorism, as we've seen from the effects of Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib, and the targeted killing practices and policies, particularly that take place now in Pakistan and Yemen. These are intellectual concepts. They require several steps of logic involving knowledge of other societies, other cultures, ones that many people treat with contempt, or at best with indifference. I think it's also important to bear in mind that it is the United States that has framed much of the term of the debate and the terms of the debate. In spite of what may be the de rigueur for policy in the stands or other countries, the United States still is the template that others react to, either negatively or positively, but is certainly the one that sets standards and sets the stage. Why? Well, first of all, I think quite obviously, the United States was the victim. U.S. citizens were largely the victims. U.S. territory was the victim of the 9/11 attacks. Two, of course, the United States is still the preeminent global power. It can dictate its vision of practices and policies internationally. And number three, maybe more subtly, the United States still considers itself, and by many is still considered, and with some degree of reason, as also the preeminent global leader on matters of human rights. Therefore, what the United States says and does is legal and appropriate and respectful of international law is very often believed even if it's incorrect. Now, among NGOs, because the idea here is to talk about what civil society can do, among those of us in the room, I suspect, there's this visceral, perhaps liberal preference for dealing with terrorism as a matter of crime, not as a matter of war. This debate has been going on for the last 11 years. Is it a crime? Is it war? Should it be this? Should it be that? You know who stands on those issues. And I think many of us in civil society have this preference for dealing with terrorism as criminality rather than war, because we are much more comfortable with the idea of human rights law than with law of armed conflict. There is the supposition, and to some extent correct, that when you allow concepts of war to enter the room and to enter the conversation, you have already permitted, given permission for degrees of violence, expanded killing, detention, trials by military instead of civil tribunals, etc., that you would not have outside of an armed conflict framework. So it does make some sense that civil society is more sympathetic and more familiar with one paradigm than the other, with human rights law rather than the law of armed conflict. Now, the UN counterterrorism policy recognizes the application of both human rights law and humanitarian law, but without a sufficient understanding and acceptance of the ideas of when it is that humanitarian law, the law of armed conflict, actually does apply, and when it applies, what it requires. And NGOs will continue to miss an opportunity to bring human rights into the realm of counterterrorism if they don't understand and accept the proper balance and apply in their advocacy the rules of the laws of armed conflict. 2 years ago, when I was temporarily the head of the Protection of Civilians Division at OCHA at the UN, I made a presentation to the Counterterrorism Implementation Task Force on the application of the laws of armed conflict. My impression was that the audience was very interested in this topic, but unlike their familiarity with human rights law, the subject was news to them. They understood, because the UN Counterterrorism Strategy already existed, that humanitarian law, the law of armed conflict, has a role to play, but how was pretty much a mystery. The question is, then why is IHL, humanitarian law, important, and what can it do? First of all, whether or not counterterrorism is taking place in a context of armed conflict, if a state says it is, as the United States does, then the way you need to talk to them is either to convince them that they're wrong, which is a very difficult thing to do, or to tell them that even if they're applying laws of armed conflict, they have to do certain things a certain way, which isn't necessarily the way they would think they have to do them. It is important first to note that you don't have to choose in this question of whether terrorism is or isn't armed conflict. It's not a legitimate question. Terrorism may occur in the context of armed conflict, or it may occur outside the context of armed conflict. I don't have time here to go through the details of when it is and when it isn't armed conflict, but these are some of the elemental things that advocates need to know in order to be able to utilize the benefits of humanitarian law in their advocacy. So what can humanitarian law actually do? Well, it determines when you are and are not allowed to kill people. It determines when you are and are not allowed to detain people. It determines how you're required to treat people and under what conditions in detention. It tells you what are the elements of due process for detainees in detention. It tells you what are the elements of due process in trials of individuals that are detained in a context of armed conflict. It deals with questions of humanitarian assistance and protection. It deals with questions of accountability for those who violate the rules. It deals with questions of the availability of remedies for those who are victims of the violations, whether they are terrorism violations or counterterrorism violations. It deals with protection of the natural environment. It deals with questions of protections of cultural property. It also deals with the question of the role of the International Committee of the Red Cross, which is entitled by international humanitarian law to visit places of detention in armed conflict, to provide for a neutral and intermediary, to provide an intermediary role in assuring that states are indeed abiding by their humanitarian law obligations. The question is still asked, well, why do we have to resort to this law of armed conflict business? Why can't we just stick with human rights law? And the answer is a simple but legalistic one. And that is that under international law, the concept of what is called lex specialis provides that when you have two legal frameworks potentially operating, human rights law and humanitarian law, you first go to the one that is the more specific for the occasion. If a state is in armed conflict, you first have to go to the law of armed conflict to determine all of these things that I just talked about. If that body of law, the Geneva Conventions, other international treaties involving armed conflict, customary international humanitarian law provide the answers, those are the answers. If it doesn't, then and only then do you look back to human rights law for the answers. And in much of armed conflict today, humanitarian law provides the same answers that human rights law does, or it doesn't provide answers at all. For example, detention in armed conflicts that involve non-state actors, and therefore you nonetheless get to the same place, which is reverting to human rights law. So if we want to speak in the language that states understand and that can be influential, rather than telling them, well, I don't care if it's armed conflict, you have to apply human rights law, and the states say, no, we don't recognize the application of human rights law in armed conflict, you've reached a stalemate. However, if you go through the analysis, understanding what the real value of humanitarian law is and how to talk to states, and particularly to armed forces, about it, then much more can be accomplished. Even though you will not necessarily be speaking to their hearts, you will be speaking to their minds. Thank you.